The desert was not made for the living. Two suns hung in the pale orange sky, burning side by side like twin furnaces that never cooled, never dimmed, and never showed mercy. The sand below them was not the soft golden sand of Earth beaches. It was red and sharp, made of broken rock dust ground down over millions of years by heat and wind. Every step in it felt like walking on ground glass. Every breath of air felt like drinking from an open flame. There was nothing out here. No trees. No shade. No water. No sound except the low, constant moan of hot wind moving across the dunes. And somewhere in the middle of all that emptiness, a man was still alive. Sergeant Owen Blake opened his eyes slowly. The first thing he felt was pain. It sat in his left side like something hot and sharp had been pushed between his ribs and left there. His head was heavy. His mouth was dry in a way that went past thirst. It was the kind of dry that made thinking difficult, made moving feel like lifting stone. He was lying on his back in the sand, half covered by a twisted piece of gray metal. Around him was the wreckage of the transport ship, Carrier 7, scattered across the desert floor in burning chunks. Seats. Cargo boxes. Broken panels with wires hanging out of them like open veins. A section of the hull was sticking out of the sand 40 meters away, still smoking from the inside. Owen did not move right away. He lay still and let his mind come back slowly, piece by piece. He remembered the mission. A routine troop transfer to the forward base on the other side of the planet. He remembered sitting in the back of the carrier with 11 other soldiers, most of them quiet, a few of them sleeping. He remembered the sudden jolt, something hitting the ship from below, something massive like the ground itself had reached up and grabbed them. He remembered the ceiling becoming the floor. He remembered screaming that was not his own. And then nothing. Until now. He turned his head carefully and looked around. There was no movement anywhere in the wreckage. No voices. No groaning. No signs of life at all. Just burning metal and red sand and that terrible, relentless heat. He was alone. Owen pressed his hand against the ground and pushed himself up slowly. The pain in his ribs flared hard and he stopped, breathed through it, then kept pushing. Getting up took almost a full minute. When he finally got to his feet and stood straight, the world tilted for a moment and he had to plant his boots wide to stay standing. He checked himself the way his training had taught him, head to toe, fast and without emotion. The wound in his left side was the worst of it. Not deep enough to be immediately fatal, but deep enough to be a serious problem if left untreated. His right knee was swollen and stiff. His forehead had a dried cut running from his hairline down to his left eyebrow. His hands were scraped and burned in places. His uniform was torn in 4 different spots. He found his pack under the metal sheet that had been covering him. It was dented and scratched but the seal was intact. He opened it and checked the contents with practiced hands. Water, 2 small containers, maybe 1.5 liters total. A basic medical kit. 2 ration bars. A survival blade. A hand torch. A communication unit. He tried the communication unit first. He pressed the emergency signal button and held it. A light blinked twice, then went dark. He tried again. Nothing. The unit was broken, probably damaged in the impact. He turned it over in his hands and looked at the cracked screen on the back. The internal antenna was snapped clean through. No signal. No rescue call. Nobody was coming because nobody knew where to look. Owen put the comm unit back into his pack without throwing it, without cursing, without any of the reactions a man might be expected to have in that moment. He had been trained for situations with no good options. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. He sealed his pack, put it on his back and started moving through the wreckage. He needed more supplies. More water above everything else. Then shelter materials. Then a way to mark his position visually in case a ship passed overhead. He had a plan. Small, simple, and focused, the only kind of plan that worked when everything had already gone wrong. He moved through the crash site slowly and carefully. The heat was enormous and he kept his movement steady to avoid sweating more than necessary. He found another water container buried under a seat, half full. He found a thermal blanket still in its packaging. He found a small emergency flare kit with 3 flares inside. He found a short metal rod that could be useful as a support post. He carried everything back to a central point near the largest piece of hull and set it all down. He was already tired. The wound in his side was making everything harder. He sat down on a piece of flat metal and drank 2 careful sips from his water, no more. He sat in the brutal heat and thought about what came next. That was when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind. The desert made strange sounds. The hot air moving over the sharp sand created tones that almost sounded like voices sometimes. He had read that in the mission briefing about this planet. Strange sounds. Ignore them. But this was not the wind. It was soft. Very soft, almost too soft to catch. But it was rhythmic, and it had a quality to it that the wind never had. It rose and fell in a pattern that felt desperate, felt weak, felt like something that was running out of strength. He sat very still and listened harder. There it was again. It was coming from somewhere to his left, maybe 30 meters away, where a section of rock shelf had collapsed against a large piece of the ship's outer hull. The two had come together at an angle, creating a dark, low space underneath them. Owen stood up slowly. He told himself it was probably nothing. An air pocket releasing pressure. A piece of metal cooling and shifting. He told himself there was no reason to walk over there when he had things to do and very little energy to waste. He walked over anyway. He crouched down in front of the gap between the rock and the hull and shone his hand torch inside. The beam cut through the dark and landed on a cluster of smooth, dark stones, but they were not stones. He could see that immediately. They were too uniform, too round, slightly too warm-looking even from a distance. They were eggs. Broken eggs. The shells were cracked and pushed outward from the inside. And moving among the broken shells were 4 very small creatures. Owen stared. They were small enough to fit in his 2 hands together. Their bodies were covered in scales that shifted color slightly in the torchlight, mostly dark gray with patches of deep green and faint bronze. They had 4 limbs, small folded structures on their backs that were clearly early wings, and long thin tails that curled and uncurled slowly. Their eyes were large and reflective, picking up the torch beam and glowing faintly in the dark. They were baby dragons. Not from any story or myth, real ones, alien ones, creatures of this world. And they were very clearly in trouble. 2 of them were lying almost flat, barely moving. One was curled tightly around itself and trembling. Only one was still trying to lift its head and make that small, desperate sound that Owen had heard across 30 meters of dead desert. He looked at them for a long time without moving. Around the nest he could see the signs clearly now, deep claw marks gouged into the rock on both sides. Scales, larger adult scales, scattered across the sand outside the gap. A dark stain on the ground that was not oil. Something big had been here and something big had fought here, and whatever had been protecting these 4 small creatures had lost that fight and was gone. They were alone. Owen sat back on his heels and looked at the open desert around him. He had almost no water. He had almost no food. He was injured, stranded, and had no way to call for help. He had a mission to survive, and survival required focus, and focus meant not taking on problems that were not his own. He looked back at the 4 tiny creatures in the dark. The one that was still moving looked directly at him. It made its sound again, small, thin, exhausted. Every practical thought in his head told him the same thing. Move on. You cannot save them. You can barely save yourself. Owen reached into his pack, took out his water container, and carefully began to pour a small amount into the curved base of a broken shell. He was staying. The first night was the hardest. Owen had no idea what baby alien dragons needed to survive. He had no guide, no manual, no one to ask. He had his eyes, his hands, his training, and the 4 small creatures in front of him who were getting weaker by the hour. He started with water. He took the curved base of the largest broken eggshell and cleaned it carefully with a corner of his thermal blanket. He poured a very small amount of water into it, barely enough to cover the bottom, and placed it inside the nest gap where the hatchlings could reach it. Then he sat back and waited. Nothing happened for a long time. The 3 weaker ones did not move. But the one that had been lifting its head, the boldest of the 4, slightly darker in color than the others with a faint reddish tint along its spine, slowly dragged itself forward on its small legs and lowered its head to the shell. It touched the water with its tongue. Then it drank. Owen let out a breath he had been holding for several minutes. He named that one ember. It seemed right. There was something burning in that small creature that the desert had not managed to put out yet. A stubbornness. A refusal to simply lie down and disappear. Over the next hour he watched the others. The one curled tightly and trembling he named Ash, pale gray scales, very still, but breathing in a way that was slightly steadier than the other 2. The 2 lying flat he named Cinder and Spark. Cinder was slightly larger. Spark was the smallest of all 4, barely bigger than Owen's closed fist, and the one he was most worried about. He moved the water shell close to each of them in turn. Ash drank a little when Owen gently guided the shell to its mouth. Cinder lifted its head after a while and drank on its own. Spark did not respond at first. Owen dipped the very tip of his finger in the water and touched it lightly to Spark's mouth. The tiny tongue moved. He did it again. And again. Until Spark was licking the water directly from his finger. That was the first moment Owen felt something shift inside him. Not a big feeling. Just a quiet one. Like a door opening a small crack. He spent the rest of that first night building a shelter. He worked slowly and carefully to protect his injured side. Using the large hull section as one wall, he built a low three-sided structure using flat rock pieces, the metal rod he had found, and the thermal blanket stretched across the top to reflect heat during the day and hold warmth at night. It was not large, just enough space for him to sit or lie down with the nest positioned at one end where it was most protected. When it was done, he crawled inside and lay on his back in the dark, listening to the desert wind and the faint small sounds of the hatchlings breathing nearby. He slept in short stretches. Every time he woke, he checked the hatchlings. Every time they were still there, still breathing, he allowed himself to close his eyes again. By morning all four were alive. That was more than he had expected. The days that followed built themselves around a simple, hard routine. Owen woke before the first sun fully rose, when the air was at its least brutal. He checked the hatchlings first, always first. Then he drank one careful sip of water and ate a small amount from his ration bars, which he stretched as far as he possibly could. Then he went out to find food for them. He had no idea what their natural diet was. He could not know. But they were young, and young creatures generally needed protein, and protein in a desert meant insects. He learned quickly where to find them: under flat rocks, in the shadow gaps between large sand formations, buried just beneath the surface in the cooler patches near the base of rock walls. He caught them with his hands, fast and patient in the way his training had made him. He crushed them between two flat stones into a rough paste, mixed in a very small amount of water to soften it, and offered it to the hatchlings on a flat piece of shell. Ember ate first as always, then Ash, then Cinder. Then Spark, slowly, still the most hesitant, still the one that made Owen watch most carefully. Finding water was harder. There were no obvious sources anywhere near the crash site. But Owen had studied the mission briefing for this planet carefully before the trip, the way he studied everything, and he remembered reading about certain desert plants that stored moisture in their root systems. He found some of them growing in the shadowed base of a rock formation about 400 meters from the shelter, low, flat, dark green plants that hugged the ground and spread wide rather than growing tall. Cutting into their roots released a small amount of clear liquid. Not much from any single plant. But he found enough of them to collect nearly half a liter each morning by working slowly along the rock base. He boiled it using a small metal cup and heat from a piece of the ship's fuel cell to make it safe, then stored it in his containers. It was not enough for comfort, but it was enough to keep them all going. The hatchlings changed as the days passed. Not quickly. Slowly, the way trust always builds, in small steps that are easy to miss until you look back and realize how far things have come. Ember was comfortable with Owen by the second day, crawling across his legs when he sat near the nest, investigating his boots with great seriousness. Ash became calm around him by the third day, no longer trembling when he reached into the nest to check on them. Cinder took longer, watching Owen carefully for several days before allowing itself to be touched, but once it accepted him it became the most physically affectionate of the group, often pressing its head against his hand with surprising firmness. Spark was last. Spark was always last. But on the fifth evening, when Owen was sitting outside the shelter watching the suns go down and trying to ignore the pain in his side that had been growing worse all day, something small and warm climbed onto his boot, walked slowly up his leg and settled itself on his knee. Owen looked down. Spark looked up at him with those large reflective eyes. He did not move for a very long time. He just sat there in the cooling desert air with the smallest of the four hatchlings resting on his knee, and he thought about how strange life was, and how it kept finding ways to matter even in places where it had no business surviving. It was also on the fifth day that Owen first saw the sandstalkers. He had gone out in the early morning to collect water from the plants when he noticed the tracks. They were large, each print nearly as long as his forearm, six-toed, pressed deep into the sand in a pattern that showed something heavy and fast. He crouched over them and studied them without touching. The edges were still sharp, meaning they were fresh. Made sometime in the night. He followed them carefully with his eyes without moving from his crouch. The trail circled. It did not go straight toward the shelter and then straight away. It circled, wide and slow, in a pattern that showed the thing making them had been moving around the camp. Checking it, learning it, returning to it more than once. That was not the behavior of a creature passing through. That was the behavior of a predator studying its target. Owen went back to the shelter and started reinforcing it. He worked all morning, dragging larger pieces of hull metal to extend the walls outward. He buried the base edges in the sand to prevent anything from pushing under them. He set simple pressure traps using bent metal pieces and sections of wire from the ship's electrical systems. Nothing that would stop a large predator, but enough to make noise when triggered, enough to give him warning. He sharpened the end of his metal rod into a crude spear point using the edge of a broken panel. He worked steadily and without rushing, checking the hatchlings each time he passed the shelter entrance. That evening he sat at the entrance of the shelter with the spear across his knees. Ember climbed up and sat on his shoulder. The other three were settled in the nest behind him. The desert darkened. The two suns dropped below the horizon one after the other. The temperature fell fast the way it always did out here, going from brutal heat to sharp cold in less than an hour. Somewhere out in the dark, beyond the reach of the torch, something moved. Owen heard it, a low, soft sound, not quite a footstep, not quite a breath. Something big and patient, moving with the careful quiet of a hunter that had done this many times before. He tightened his grip on the spear. He had known this was coming. He had prepared as well as one injured man with salvaged materials could prepare. Whether that was going to be enough he honestly did not know. But he was between them and whatever was out there. And he intended to stay there. The sky changed on the seventh day. Owen noticed it in the morning when he went out to collect water. The air felt different. Not hotter, different. There was a pressure in it, a thickness like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The horizon to the west, which was normally a clean hard line between red sand and pale sky, had turned the color of old rust. Not a cloud. Not a storm in the way Earth storms looked. Something else. Something bigger. He stood and watched it for a long moment. Then he went back to the shelter and started preparing. He did not know exactly what was coming, but his instincts, sharpened by years of training in difficult environments, told him it was going to be serious. He pulled every loose item inside the shelter. He pressed additional sand against the base of the walls to seal the gaps better. He took the thermal blanket from the roof and replaced it with two overlapping sections of hull metal, dragging them into position and weighing their edges down with the heaviest rocks he could carry without tearing his wound open further. His side had been getting worse. He knew that and had been trying not to think about it too directly. The cut was not infected as far as he could tell, but the constant physical work of the past week had kept it from healing properly. It pulled and burned when he lifted anything heavy. Some mornings it was stiff in a way that made standing up a slow and careful process. He pressed through it. There was no alternative. By midday the western sky had turned darker. The rust color had deepened into something closer to brown, and now Owen could see movement in it. The storm was not a wall moving toward him but a churning, rolling mass that filled the entire western horizon from ground to sky. The wind had picked up significantly. It threw sand against the shelter walls in short, hard bursts, and the sound it made was not a moan anymore but something sharper, more aggressive. Owen checked the hatchlings. All four were inside the nest, pressed together tightly. They could feel it too. Even Ember, who was usually restless and curious and always wanted to be climbing on something, was still and low in the nest with the others. Their eyes tracked Owen as he moved around the shelter, and there was something in their expressions that he had learned to read over the past week, a watchful, waiting tension. He gave them water and a small amount of food. He checked the walls one more time. He picked up his spear and sat down at the entrance with his back against the hull wall and his legs stretched out in front of him. The storm hit in the late afternoon. It did not build gradually. One moment it was bad and the next moment it was everything. The wind went from strong to violent in the space of about 10 seconds, and the sand it carried came horizontally, a solid rushing mass of red particles that reduced visibility to almost nothing within moments. The noise was enormous, a deep, continuous roar that swallowed all other sounds completely, a sound so large and constant that it stopped feeling like noise and started feeling like pressure. The shelter held. The metal roof rattled and shook but the weights kept it down. The walls pressed inward slightly at the top but did not give. Sand poured through every small gap and built up along the inside of the base, but Owen had prepared for that and the gaps were small enough that the sand came in slowly. He sat in the near dark of the shelter with the hatchlings behind him and the storm screaming outside, and he breathed slowly and steadily. He checked his spear. He checked his blade, which was in his belt on the left side. He made sure both were loose and ready, because he was thinking about the sand stalkers. He had seen their tracks every morning for 3 days. The circles they made around the camp had been getting smaller each night, closer, more confident, more deliberate. Whatever they were intelligent enough to study a target before attacking. They had been waiting, calculating, deciding when the moment was right. A storm that blinded everything and drowned out all sound was exactly the kind of moment a patient predator waited for. He heard the first one 18 minutes after the storm hit. Not with his ears, the storm made hearing anything impossible. He felt it. A vibration through the shelter wall against his back, different from the wind, rhythmic in a way the storm was not. Something heavy landing against the outer wall. What? Then again. Owen was on his feet before the third impact. He moved to the entrance gap, a low opening he had left between two hull sections, just wide enough to push through. He looked out into the storm and saw almost nothing. Red-brown darkness. Sand moving in sheets. Shapes that might be rocks or might be something else entirely. Then one of the shapes moved toward him. It was enormous. Even in the near-zero visibility of the storm he could see the size of it. Low to the ground, longer than he was tall, 6 legs moving in a fast fluid pattern that was somehow both heavy and quiet. The head was wide and flat with 2 pale eyes that cut through the sand-filled air like lights. It had seen him the moment he appeared at the entrance. It charged. Owen threw himself sideways as it hit the entrance. The creature's head smashed through the gap he had been standing in, widening it instantly, sending one of the hull sections spinning away into the storm. Owen rolled, came up on one knee, and drove the spear into the side of the creature's neck as it pulled its head back out. The sand stalker screamed, a sound that somehow cut through even the storm's roar, and pulled away hard, taking the spear with it. The shaft snapped. Owen was left with half a spear and a creature that was hurt but not stopped. It came again, lower this time, faster. Owen dropped flat and it passed over him, its underside scraping across his back hard enough to knock the air out of his lungs. He rolled again, grabbed the broken spear shaft, and stabbed upward twice into the creature's exposed belly as it passed. It convulsed. Its legs buckled on the left side and it went down hard into the sand, thrashing. Owen did not wait to watch it stop moving. He was already turning because he had felt the second vibration, from the other side of the shelter. The second sand stalker had gone around. It came through the back wall, simply pushing through it with its body weight, the metal sections folding inward like they were made of paper. It was inside the shelter before Owen could get there, and it was between him and the nest. Between him and ember and ash and cinder and spark. Owen did not think. He moved. He went straight at it, which was the last thing a prey animal would do and the one thing the creature did not seem prepared for. He hit it low on the left side with his full body weight, driving his shoulder into it and pushing with everything his legs had. The creature stumbled sideways. Owen lost his footing and went down with it. They hit the ground together. What followed was not a fight in any clean sense of the word. It was close and desperate and ugly. Owen used the broken spear shaft, his blade, his elbows, his boots. The sand stalker used its legs and its teeth. It caught him once across the left arm, once across the lower back. Both times he kept moving, kept pressing, kept working inward where its legs could not reach him effectively. It ended when he drove his blade into the creature's eye with both hands and pushed until it stopped moving. He lay on the ground beside it for a moment, breathing in ragged pulls, unable to do anything else. Then he heard the sounds from the nest. Small and frightened and very close. He crawled. His left arm was not working properly. His lower back was a wall of pain. The shelter was half destroyed around him and the storm was pouring sand through the open sections. He crawled across the shelter floor toward the nest, reached it and pulled himself up over it with the last of what he had. He spread himself across it, arms out, body flat. His chest and shoulders covering as much of the nest as he could reach. The cold storm air poured over his back and the sand stung every cut on his body and the pain in his side had become something enormous and constant. But underneath him, pressed against the floor of the nest, all 4 hatchlings were alive and unharmed. He could feel them moving under him. Small worms pressing back against his chest. Tiny legs and tails shifting. And then, slowly, one by one, they began to press upward against him, not trying to get away but pushing into him. Sharing whatever small heat their small bodies held. Owen pressed his forehead down against the edge of the nest and closed his eyes. His voice when it came was barely more than breath. Guess we're family now. The storm roared on above them both. The storm ended before sunrise. It stopped almost as suddenly as it had started. The roaring wind dropping away in stages, the sand settling back down to the ground in slow drifting curtains, the air clearing gradually until the desert was quiet again. A deep, empty quiet that felt almost unnatural after the violence of the night before. Owen did not notice the storm ending. He was unconscious. He had held his position across the nest for as long as his body allowed, which was longer than most people could have managed and not as long as he had wanted. At some point in the deep hours of the night, with the storm still howling and the cold pressing down hard, his body had simply made the decision for him. The pain, the blood loss, the exhaustion of a week of survival followed by 2 fights in a single night, it had all collected into something too heavy to carry anymore and he had gone under. He lay collapsed across and beside the nest, one arm still stretched over it, his face turned to the side against the sand. His breathing was slow and shallow. The cuts on his arm and lower back had bled through the rough bandaging he had managed to wrap before losing consciousness. His skin was pale under the desert grit that covered him. The 4 hatchlings were pressed against him. Not inside the nest now but outside it, arranged around his body in the way that made the most sense to their instincts. Ember tucked against his chest, Ash curled near his shoulder, Cinder pressed along his left side, and Spark, the smallest, sitting directly on his neck with its tail wrapped once around as if holding on. They were keeping him warm the only way they knew how. They had been doing it all night. The first sun rose and painted the desert in pale orange light. The second followed 20 minutes later, adding its harsher light to the first. The temperature began to climb. The sand that had been rearranged by the storm settled into new shapes, covering the remains of the 2 sand stalkers in gradual drifts that would finish burying them completely before midday. The hatchlings stayed where they were. They did not go looking for food or water. They did not explore the changed landscape around the shelter the way they normally would have in the morning. They stayed close to Owen and they stayed alert, their heads up, their eyes moving across the desert in all directions. They were watching. It was Ember who saw her first. The small hatchling lifted its head sharply at something to the south and made a sound Owen had never heard from any of them before, not the weak cries of the first day, not the comfortable chirping sounds they made when they were settled and fed. This was something else. Something between a call and a warning, high and clear and carrying. The other 3 heard it and responded immediately, all 4 heads turning south together. She came out of the early morning light like something that had always been there and had only just decided to be visible. Vareth was enormous. Owen had seen large creatures in his years of service on different worlds, things that made human-built vehicles look small, things that changed the way you understood the word large permanently. But Vareth was a different kind of impressive. She was not just big, she was built in a way that made every part of her make sense. Long and powerful through the body, for legs that moved with absolute certainty across the uneven sand, a neck that rose and curved with a natural authority that needed no effort to communicate. Her scales were deep charcoal gray with patterns of dark green running in lines from her neck down across her flanks, and they caught the early sunlight in a way that made her seem to shift color slightly as she moved. Her wings were folded close against her body. She was not flying. She was walking, and she was walking with the focused, deliberate pace of something that knew exactly where it was going and had been trying to get there for days. She was scarred. Owen would have noticed that even from a distance. Fresh damage across her left shoulder, deep marks that had barely begun to close. A section of scale missing along her jaw on the right side, the skin beneath it still raw and dark. She had fought something recently and she had fought it hard, and the fact that she was walking meant she had won, but it had not been easy. She stopped 40 meters from the shelter. Her eyes found the nest immediately. Then they found the 4 hatchlings arranged around the unconscious human between her and it. Then they moved slowly across everything else. The broken shelter walls, the half-buried shapes of the 2 sand stalkers, the scattered remains of the fortifications Owen had built, the water shells, the feeding stones, the small careful details of a camp that someone had made and maintained with purpose. She was still for a long time, just reading it all. Then she took one step forward. All 4 hatchlings moved at once. They positioned themselves between Vareth and Owen in a line that was almost perfectly straight, which was remarkable for creatures so young. Their small wings spread as wide as they could go, which was not very wide at all but was clearly the largest gesture their bodies could make. They held their heads low and their feet planted, and they faced their own mother with an expression that communicated something absolutely clear across every possible language barrier. Do not touch him. Vareth stopped. She looked at them. She looked at the line they had made. She looked at the way Ember, at the center of the line, held its ground without flinching even as Varetha's shadow fell across all 4 of them. Something changed in Varetha's posture. It was subtle, a slight release of tension in her neck, a lowering of her head by just a few degrees. Not submission. Something more like recalibration. She was a highly intelligent creature and she was reading a situation that was telling her something she had not expected. She lowered herself to the ground. Slowly all the way down, legs folding beneath her until her belly was in the sand. The large head came down too, stretching forward along the ground until it was level and still. She waited. The hatchlings held their position for another moment. Then Ember made a different sound, shorter, lower, and stepped aside. The others followed. The line dissolved. Vareth raised her head and looked at Owen. She moved forward slowly, each step placed with care, her body low, her whole manner completely different from the powerful stride she had arrived with. She stopped when she was close enough to reach him and extended her neck until her nose was inches from his face. She breathed him in. Long and slow, the way her kind read the world, through scent, through chemical information that told a story more complete than anything eyes alone could see. She read the blood on his bandages. She read the sweat and exhaustion on his skin. She read the sand stalker on him, the fight, the effort. She read the fact that he had not moved from the nest even after the fighting was done. She read the hatchlings on him, their scent worked into his clothing and skin from days of contact, days of closeness, days of being carried and fed and sheltered by these hands. She stayed with her nose near his face for a long time. Then she raised her head and looked at the 4 hatchlings who had come forward now and were moving around her legs, making sounds that she answered in low tones too deep for Owen to have heard even if he were awake. A conversation happening in a register below the level of the morning air. Vareth looked at Owen once more. Then she did something that no recorded study of the Vorkai species had ever documented happening toward any creature outside their own kind. She lowered her head. All the way down, the great neck bending until her forehead was near the ground, her eyes level with the sand, her whole enormous body folded inward in a gesture that was unmistakable in its meaning even to someone who had never seen it before. It was not a bow of defeat. It was not a bow of fear. It was the bow of one being to another who has done something that demands recognition. The highest gesture the Vorkai had. The one they gave only when words, if they had used words, would not have been enough. She held it. Then she lifted her head and moved to Owen's injured side. She opened her mouth slightly and pressed her tongue gently to the worst of his wounds, the long cut on his left side that had been the source of his trouble since the first day. Her saliva was warm and carried something chemical and powerful in it. Where it touched, the inflamed edges of the wound began to calm almost immediately, the deep red color pulling back, the heat fading. She worked slowly and carefully, moving from wound to wound, giving each one the same quiet attention. She did not stop until she had covered every cut on his body. Then she settled beside him, her great body curved slightly inward, and she waited for him to wake up. The hatchlings climbed back into their positions around Owen. Ember on his chest, Spark on his shoulder, Ash and Cinder pressed to his sides. The desert morning moved on around them, warm and still and quiet. And for the first time since the crash, Owen Blake was not alone in the way that mattered. Owen woke slowly. The first thing he felt was warmth. Not the brutal pressing heat of the desert suns, but something gentler and closer, warmth coming from multiple directions at once, surrounding him from the sides and above in a way that made no immediate sense to his still waking mind. He lay still for a moment and let his eyes adjust to the light. Ember was on his chest. Ash was pressed against his right arm. Cinder and Spark were tucked against his left side. And beyond them, curved around the outside of the group like a living wall, was something so large that Owen's eyes took a moment to fully process what they were seeing. Vareth was watching him. Her great head was lowered to just above ground level, close enough that Owen could see the detail of her scales and the slow steady rhythm of her breathing. Her eyes, deep amber larger than Owen's entire hand, were open and calm and fixed directly on his face with an expression that carried patience and something else he could not quite name. Owen stayed very still. His brain was catching up quickly, the storm, the fight, the wounds collapsing across the nest. And then the memory of that enormous head lowering to the ground beside him before he had fully lost consciousness. He moved his left arm carefully. The pain was there but it was different. Reduced. He looked down at the wound on his side and found it changed. The angry red color was gone, the swelling was down, and the edges had begun to pull together in a way that should have taken many more days without treatment. He touched it lightly with 2 fingers and felt warmth but not the sharp deep burn of before. He looked at Vareth. She had done that. While he slept, she had done that. Owen sat up slowly and the hatchlings shifted around him, adjusting without waking, resettling against his legs and lap as he moved. He looked at Vareth for a long moment in the quiet morning air. Then he pressed his fist gently against his chest and bent his head forward, the closest thing he could offer to the gesture she had given him. He was not sure she would understand it. She lowered her head slowly in return. He was fairly sure she understood it. The days that followed had a different quality to them. The desperate edge was still there. Owen was still injured, still low on supplies, still stranded with no working communication, but something in the situation had shifted in a way that changed everything. Vareth knew the desert. She knew where water was, real water, not the small amounts Owen had been extracting from plant roots. On the second morning after her return she simply stood up, looked at Owen and walked south. Then she stopped and looked back. Owen picked up his pack and followed her. She led him to a place 2 kilometers from the camp where a section of flat rock had a crack running through it, and from that crack seeped a thin but constant trickle of water that collected in a shallow natural bowl at the base. Clean, cold, real water. Owen filled every container he had and drank carefully and felt something ease in his body that had been tight for days. He looked at Vareth. She was watching him with that same patient expression. He shook his head slowly and almost smiled. She also kept the sandstalkers away. Not by fighting them, her presence alone was enough. Owen found no new tracks after her arrival. Whatever the sandstalkers calculated when they measured risk and reward, a fully grown Vorkai in the area changed that calculation completely. The circles stopped. The nighttime sounds stopped. The weight of constant watchfulness that Owen had been carrying since day 5 lifted in a way he had not realized how much it had been costing him until it was gone. He used the easier days to recover and to spend time with the hatchlings, who were growing visibly now that food and water were more consistent. Ember had become bolder than ever, often climbing to Owen's shoulder and sitting there surveying the desert with the serious expression of someone who owned it. Ash had developed a habit of following Vareth closely, mimicking her movements in a way that made Owen watch with quiet amusement. Cinder had found its voice and used it constantly, making sounds at everything: rocks, wind, Owen's boots, clouds. Spark had filled out noticeably, no longer the fragile smallest one but a healthy, bright-eyed creature who moved with increasing confidence. Owen watched them and felt something he could not easily put a name to. Something that sat in his chest warmly and did not ask to be examined. It was on the 11th day after Varetha's return that Owen heard it. A sound from above. Distant at first, then growing, the specific deep vibration of large engines running on a controlled descent pattern. Not a natural sound. Not a sound this planet made on its own. A ship. Owen was on his feet immediately, shading his eyes with his hand and scanning the sky. There, to the northeast, dropping through the upper atmosphere in a long controlled arc, a vessel. Not military. The shape was wrong for military. Wider through the middle, slower in its descent angle. A search and rescue configuration. His emergency flares were in the pack. He had them out and the first one fired before the ship had finished its descent arc. The red light climbed into the pale sky and hung there, bright and clear. The ship changed its angle toward him. Owen turned to check on Vareth and the hatchlings. Vareth had already risen to her full height, her eyes on the descending ship, her posture shifted into something watchful and tense. The hatchlings had gathered close to her, pressed against her legs. Owen walked to Vareth and stood beside her. Not between her and the ship. Beside her. The ship landed 400 meters away, sending a wave of sand outward from its landing pads. It was large, a deep space rescue vessel, Alliance registry markings on the hull. The landing ramp came down and figures appeared at the top of it. They stopped. Owen could see them clearly, a mixed crew, several different species, standing at the top of the ramp and looking at what was in front of them with an absolute stillness that told him everything he needed to know about how this looked from their perspective. A human soldier, visibly wounded, standing calmly in the open desert beside a fully grown Vorkai dragon while 4 juvenile Vorkai moved around his feet. One figure came down the ramp. An insectoid alien, tall and angular, wearing a captain's insignia on a gray uniform. 4 arms, 2 sets of compound eyes, a movement pattern that was fast and precise. Owen recognized the species. Thennery, known for being excellent navigators and deeply uncomfortable with situations that did not follow established procedure. The captain stopped 20 meters away and looked at the scene in front of him for a long moment. Then he spoke in translated galactic common through a device at his collar. His voice was flat and careful in the way of someone who was working very hard to stay calm. Sergeant. I am Commander Thesic of the Alliance rescue vessel Ardent Cross. We picked up a secondary distress signal from this crash site. You need to come with us immediately. Owen looked at him steadily. I appreciate the pickup, Commander. I'll board when I'm ready. Thesic's 4 arms shifted in a pattern that Owen recognized as agitation. The Vorkai are a protected species. Unsanctioned contact is a serious violation of... The contact was not unsanctioned, Owen said. It was necessary. And it's done now. You need to come now, Sergeant. I will come, Owen said. When they are safe. Thesic stared at him. Behind the commander, the crew at the top of the ramp had not moved. They were watching with the focused attention of people seeing something they were not sure they would ever see again. Vareth had not moved either. But her eyes were on Thesic with an expression that required no translation. Thesic looked at Vareth. Then back at Owen. Then he made a gesture with 2 of his arms that meant something in Thennery body language that Owen did not know, but which looked remarkably like stepping back from an argument. How long? Thesic said flatly. However long it takes, Owen said. It took 2 days. Owen walked with Vareth and the hatchlings south and east, following a route that Vareth chose, toward the deep desert territories that were Vorkai land, mapped, protected, off-limits to all Alliance traffic. The rescue crew followed at a distance in their ship, tracking slowly overhead. Nobody spoke much during those 2 days. The crew took turns watching from the observation window. Owen walked and the dragons walked with him, and the desert moved past on all sides in its red and silent way. On the second afternoon Vareth stopped. Owen looked at the ground ahead and understood. The sand changed color here, slightly darker, the mineral composition different, the air above it carrying a faint scent that was not desert. This was the boundary. Vorkai territory began here. Vareth turned to Owen. The hatchlings came to him one by one. Ember pressed its head hard against his hand and held it there for a long moment. Ash leaned into his leg. Cinder made its sounds, quieter than usual. Spark climbed to his knee, looked at his face with those reflective eyes, then climbed back down. Owen crouched down to their level and stayed there for a while without speaking. Then he stood up and looked at Vareth. She lowered her head to him once more. Long and slow and all the way down. Owen pressed his fist to his chest and bent his head forward. He stood and watched them cross the boundary and move into their territory until they were small in the distance. Then he turned and walked back toward the ship. The entire crew was silent as he came up the ramp. Not one of them said a single word. The ramp closed behind Owen and the ship lifted off. He stood in the loading bay for a moment and felt the vibration of the engines move through the floor and up through his boots. The familiar feeling of a vessel leaving the ground. The familiar feeling of leaving somewhere behind. He had done it hundreds of times in his career. Boarded ships after missions, left planets, closed chapters. It was a thing soldiers did constantly, and most of the time it meant nothing more than moving to the next thing. This time it felt different. He did not examine that feeling too closely. He set his pack down against the wall, sat on the bench that ran along the side of the loading bay, and let himself be still for the first time in what felt like a very long time. His body ached in too many places to list. His side, which Vareth's treatment had improved significantly, still pulled when he breathed deeply. His knee was stiff. His hands were a collection of cuts and burns in various stages of healing. He was alive. He was on a ship. The hatchlings were safe in their territory with their mother. That was everything he had needed to accomplish, and he had accomplished it. He closed his eyes and the ship carried him upward. A crew member brought him water and a medical kit 20 minutes later. She was young, a feln, a species with pale blue skin and large dark eyes and 4 fingers on each hand. She moved quietly and set the items beside him without making a production of it, which he appreciated. He used the medical kit carefully, working through each wound in order of severity, doing the job properly now that he had the supplies to do it right. The Feln crew member did not leave. She sat across from him at a respectful distance and watched him work with an expression that was clearly full of questions she had not yet decided whether to ask. Owen finished bandaging his arm and looked up at her. "Go ahead," he said. She blinked. "I did not say anything." "You were thinking loud," Owen said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she straightened slightly in her seat and asked the question in careful, considered galactic common. "Why did you do it?" Owen looked at her. "The Vorkai," she said. "We have studied them for many years. They do not accept outsiders. They do not allow contact. They have injured or driven away every researcher and diplomat who has ever attempted to approach them." She paused. "You were injured and alone with almost no supplies. You could have used your energy only on surviving. Instead you used it on them." Another pause, shorter. "Why?" Owen was quiet for a moment. Not because he did not know the answer, but because he wanted to find the right words for it. The simple true ones, not the complicated ones that sounded better but meant less. "They were small," he said. "They were scared. And there was nobody else." He looked at her steadily. That was enough. The Feln crew member looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she reached into the front pocket of her uniform and took out a small flat device. A personal recording journal, the kind crew members used to log private notes during long voyages. She opened it and wrote something in it carefully. Owen watched her write. "You're writing that down," he said. "Yes," she said simply, as if it were obvious. "It was not a remarkable thing," Owen said. She looked up at him. "Where I come from," she said quietly, "the most remarkable things are usually the ones that the person who did them thinks were not remarkable at all." She closed the journal, stood, and gave him a small formal nod before leaving the bay. Owen sat alone with the medical kit and the water and the hum of the ship around him and thought about what she had said. Commander Thesic came to see him an hour later. He stood at the entrance to the bay with 2 of his 4 arms folded and the other 2 loose at his sides, which in Thenry posture meant something between uncertain and reluctant. the posture of someone who had come to say something they had not fully prepared for. Owen waited. "I have filed the incident report," Thesic said. He was using the same flat, controlled voice as before, but there was something slightly different in it now. Something that was not quite warmth but was perhaps the space where warmth might eventually be possible. "The contact with the Vorkai will be logged as an unsanctioned event with extenuating circumstances." Pause. The extenuating circumstances section required more words than the rest of the report combined. Owen almost smiled. "I imagine it did." Thesic was quiet for a moment. Then, in a slightly different register, he said, "My crew has been on 14 rescue operations across 9 planets. They have seen a great many things." He stopped. Started again. "None of them have spoken of anything the way they are speaking of what they saw today." Owen said nothing. "You should rest," Thesic said and left. Owen lay back on the bench and looked at the ceiling of the loading bay and let the ship carry him through space, and eventually he slept, deeply and without dreaming, for the first time in 2 weeks. The report Thesic filed moved through Alliance administrative channels in the usual slow way that such reports moved. It was reviewed, flagged for unusual content, reviewed again by a senior officer, flagged again, and eventually landed on the desk of a Galactic Alliance Cultural Affairs Director who read it 3 times before setting it down and sitting quietly for a while. It was classified as the first recorded voluntary bonding event between a human and the Vorkai species. Initiated by the Vorkai. That detail was underlined in the final version of the report by 3 different people at 3 different levels of review, each of whom apparently felt independently that it was the kind of detail that should not be allowed to pass without emphasis. Owen was debriefed, treated at a medical facility, given 2 weeks of mandatory rest, and returned to service. He did not speak publicly about what had happened on the desert planet. He answered the official questions he was required to answer, and he answered them honestly, and then he went back to his work. But the story moved the way true stories move, not through announcements or official channels but person to person, told and retold by the crew of the Arden Cross to the people they knew, and by those people to others. The Feln crew member whose name was Saya shared what Owen had said in the loading bay. Not publicly at first. Just with people she trusted. Just the words themselves, plain and simple as he had said them. They were small. They were scared. And there was nobody else. That was enough. Those words had a quality to them that made people repeat them. Something in the plainness of them. Something in the complete absence of heroism in the way they were constructed, which somehow made them more powerful than any heroic statement could have been. They spread. 7 months after the crash on the desert planet, a Galactic Alliance diplomatic team was sent to attempt formal contact with the Vorkai. It was not the first such attempt. There had been 11 previous attempts over the past 40 years, and all 11 had ended the same way, with the diplomats leaving quickly and the Vorkai returning to their territories unchanged and uninterested. The team landed at the edge of Vorkai territory in a formal diplomatic vessel with all the correct flags and all the correct protocols. They waited at the boundary in the correct posture of peaceful approach that the Alliance Cultural Handbook specified. For a long time nothing happened. Then the Vorkai came. Not many, 3 adults, moving across the dark sand with that fluid, powerful stride that cameras and descriptions never quite managed to capture accurately. The diplomatic team held their positions and waited, following their training, keeping still and calm. The lead Vorkai stopped in front of them. She was large and gray-scaled with patterns of dark green along her flanks. She was scarred, a healed mark across her left shoulder, a section of different colored scale along her jaw where damage had regrown slightly differently than the original. She looked at the diplomatic team with amber eyes that moved from face to face with clear intelligence and assessment. The team's lead diplomat, a senior Alliance official named Pren, took a careful step forward and began the formal greeting sequence in the Vorkai tonal language that linguists had spent years building from limited recordings. The large Vorkai watched him. Then she lowered her head slowly in the gesture that every member of the team had been briefed on, the Vorkai bow, the highest gesture of recognition their kind possessed. The entire diplomatic team went very still. Pren, who had been in diplomatic service for 30 years and believed he had seen everything worth seeing, found that he could not speak for a moment. Then one of his junior team members made a quiet sound and pointed. On the left side of Veritha's neck, where the scales ran in a smooth line from her jaw down to her shoulder, there was a mark. Not damage. Not a scar from fighting. Something different. A shape worked carefully into the healed tissue, the scales grown back around it in a way that preserved it clearly. Someone, or something, had made that mark deliberately, and the flesh had healed around it and kept it. The shape was simple. 2 curved lines meeting at a point and rising again. Clean and clear and unmistakable. The letter O. Pren stared at it. He had read the report. He had read it several times because it was the kind of report that demanded several readings. He knew what that letter meant and who had put it there and why. He thought about a human soldier alone in a desert with no supplies and no rescue and 4 small creatures who needed something and nobody else to give it. He thought about words spoken quietly in a ship's loading bay to a young crew member with a journal. They were small. They were scared. And there was nobody else. That was enough. Pren pressed his fist against his chest and bent his head forward. Vareth held his gaze with those great amber eyes. Behind him, one by one, every member of the diplomatic team did the same. The desert was quiet around them. The sky was wide and pale. And the galaxy, in that moment, understood something about humans that no report and no briefing and no amount of study had ever quite managed to put into words. They do not need a reason to protect the helpless. They just do.